Hello dear visitors, today I have a very special video for you. We're not just going to cross distance and time, but in today's video we'll cross the borders of the worlds, of different worlds themselves. Because we are looking at two characters from two universes that I describe here on this channel. And those two characters are so different but so alike in so many ways. But what we're going to look at first and foremost in this video is the way they fight and how would they fare against each other in different circumstances. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I appreciate this very much. Thank you. And despite the fact that those characters, as I've already told you, are very different, in some ways they have a very similar destiny actually. In a way, both of them were born to power. They both had a kind of a station, kind of an office that they were going to get, they were going to inherit from their fathers. But both of them, even though they did take their fathers' respective titles, both of them lived to outgrow their father's positions. For Aragorn, also known as Elessar, which means elven stone in Elvish, it was the position of the chieftain of the Dúnadan, which was in a way more of a nominal position. Yes, it was in high regard among some very powerful individuals and some very powerful people in Middle-earth and peoples in Middle-earth, but still the chieftain of the Dúnadan was no king, and he had no formal authority over anyone besides maybe his own tribe of the Númenóreans, of the last remnants of the Númenóreans. As for Atreides, he inherited the title, his father's title of Duke. But even though in comparison to the title of the chieftain of the Dúnadan, the title of Duke in the Dune's universe means much more, still Paul Atreides happened to inherit this title in such a disastrous situation for him and his family that in a way, while he inherited this title, he was almost deprived of all his power. Well, at least at that very moment he was deprived of all his power. So in that way they were quite equal with Aragorn at the moment of their respective inheritance of their respective titles. And later, which is another thing in common in their destiny, both of them surpassed their original titles by far and surpassed their fathers, who were very good men, very respected men, but still both Paul and Aragorn, they accomplished much more than their own fathers. But I think that they deserve a special video for each of them concerning their late political careers, so to say, and maybe not even one video for each. But let's continue with the topic that we're going to analyze today. But interestingly enough, besides their major destiny, major political careers that have similarities, they also have similarities in terms of how they were brought for combat, because both of them share a very similar story in terms of their fighting prowess, in terms of their fighting knowledge and military knowledge as well. But now let's focus on each one of them at a time. And let's start with Paul Atreides. First, let me tell you about his physical stature, physical attributes, so to say. In terms of his height, he was of an average height probably, or maybe even a little bit less than average. As for his stature, he himself describes his body as being, his body when he just came to Dune, as being the body of an exotic off-worlder, slim and wiry, but water-fat when compared to Freeman. This description is given by him when, after 12 years of his... there's a small spoiler here, so for those of you who haven't yet read the first book till the end, or for those of you who have just watched the first movie, I mean the new movie, part 1, you should be aware that there'll be a small spoiler here. So this description of himself is made by him after 12 years of his reign as an emperor on Arrakis. It's a small excerpt from the second big book in the Dune series called Dune Messiah. You shouldn't mix it up with the book number 2 in the first big book, Dune, which is called Muad'Dib. So let's read this excerpt. Paul stared down at his own body. Hard muscles, slender. A few more scars, but essentially the same despite 12 years as emperor. Looking up, he glimpsed his face in a shelf mirror. Blue Freeman eyes, mark of spice addiction, a sharp Atreides nose. He looked the proper grandson for an Atreides who had died in the bull ring, creating a spectacle for his people. So you see, even after 12 years, his body constitution stayed the same, more or less, and so we can safely say that no matter what period of his history we take into account, we can say that his physical attributes stayed more or less the same. Now let's discuss his weapons masters, his teachers, how he was mentored to fight, and what were the strong characteristics in his martial education, and what characteristics probably lacked, at least in comparison to Aragorn. First of all, when we take into account the upbringing of such an important figure as a Duke's heir in the Dune universe, we should understand that the whole Dune universe almost lacks any serious threat for such an individual from conventional projectile weapons. And this is due to the use of the shield technology, which practically makes any fast projectile attack useless against somebody protected by a shield. And so, one word about the shields in Dune universe: they stop. The faster the attack that goes into them, the more they stop it, and that's probably the reason why las cannons directed at shields are known to evoke a kind of a nuclear explosion, an analog of a nuclear explosion, just because the speed of this projectile, this las weapon, is so fast that the shield reacts in such an explosive manner. But this is my explanation of why this is so. I don't remember if Frank Herbert himself had given such an explanation in his books, but I think that this one makes sense. So returning to our topic, the use of shields by individual fighters or even groups of individual fighters greatly changes the picture of any combat, of any modern for the Dune universe combat, because first of all, it should and it does include lots of hand-to-hand combat weapons, lots of close quarters combat weapons. And if we also consider the fact that the Dune universe described in Frank Herbert's books is taking place in the far, far future of humanity. That in connection with, I suppose, a very, very ancient invention of shields, means that people in the Dune universe have lots and lots of experience of melee combat and of fencing. And so such an important figure as Duke's heir, whose father is usually the planet's ruler, the planet's governor, which means that his power in comparison to even the kings of Middle-earth is in many ways even greater, and such an individual must have the best teachers, the best swordsmen who can upbring him in terms of combat from a very young age. And naturally, Paul Atreides had no lack of such teachers. Let's look at how his teachers are described in the first book. Let me read you this small piece of text. I think you'll find it interesting. You have read that Muad'Dib had no playmates his own age on Caladan. The dangers were too great. But Muad'Dib did have wonderful companion teachers. There was Gurney Halleck, the troubadour warrior. You all seen some of Gurney's songs as you read along in this book. There was Thufir Hawat, the old Mentat, master of assassins, who struck fear even into the heart of the Padishah Emperor. There were Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster of the Ginas, Dr. Wellington Yue, a name black in treachery but bright in knowledge, the Lady Jessica, who guided her son in the Bene Gesserit way, and of course the Duke Leto, whose qualities as a father have long been overlooked. From A Child's History of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. So, as you can see, he had a very professional, diverse, and proficient in their own ways group of teachers. And I would say that even though most of his martial training was done by Duncan Idaho, who is described in one of the books like this: one of the finest swordsmen in history, an advisor to the Atreides, a military genius. This description really speaks for itself. But we still shouldn't overlook the way his other mentors influenced his fighting ability. I would say that his training with Thufir Hawat and his mother, who was proficient in the so-called Weirden way of fighting, and occasional lessons with Gurney Halleck, plus his very good relationship with his father, his son-father relationship that seemed very, very open and healthy, I believe also had a very positive effect on his training. And I suppose that his father occasionally gave him lessons in fencing and in other ways of fighting and in strategy too, which is a very important subject when somebody is trying to prepare a warrior, because a warrior who just knows techniques, in my opinion, is not a complete warrior. A warrior should also be able to think for himself, to create strategies on the go if needed, or maybe to create them beforehand when he has time. And that way he can be much more effective, even when we take into account some kind of a one-on-one combat, a duel, for example. So all in all, Paul Atreides had an impressive training record when it comes to fighting. But let's see what we can say about Aragorn, and then we'll try to compare them. Speaking about Aragorn, let's start with his physical attributes in the same way as we have done for Paul Atreides. And while I'm doing so, I think it makes sense to gently start comparing them already, so we can start accumulating and analyzing some of the data which will help us to answer our question, the main question of this video, which is who would win in a fight, Aragorn or Atreides, and in what kind of fight would they win against each other. So when we're talking about physical attributes of Aragorn, we can cautiously say that in this medium Aragorn has an upper hand. First of all, you should understand that Aragorn is not your regular human like, for example, Boromir or Faramir in the world of the Lord of the Rings. He's much more. So for those of you who are not that familiar with the deep lore of the Lord of the Rings universe, so to say, it will probably be a surprise, it will probably come up as a surprise that Aragorn has elvish blood in him. Well, he is called Elfstone for a reason, you know. And more than that, he is one of the direct relatives of Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, who is, which will probably also be a surprise for many of you, actually a half-elf who chose elven destiny and immortal life, making him fully an elf in this respect, but still he has genes of 50% of his genes are from a human, which makes him quite special in this way. But we'll probably talk about choosing the destiny for half-elves in some other video, but for now it suffices to say that Elrond was fully an elf in terms of his immortality, but still half-elven in terms of his physical attributes. And Aragorn, being his descendant, also got a big part of elven blood in him, because Aragorn's line comes from Elrond's brother, Elros, and Elros is the main ancestor, the progenitor of the whole Númenórean line, the whole line of human kings, but still with a big part of their blood being elven, which in my opinion is the reason why they live quite a lot more than usual humans. And for most Númenóreans it was, well, in the beginning of the Fourth Age and through the Fourth Age of Middle-earth, they had a lifespan about 2 times more than the usual human, and Aragorn himself, he had a lifespan like 3 times more than your usual human. So what can we take from this part of his ancestry? And by the way, probably that makes Elrond not his direct relative, but a very close relative, because his direct ancestor is Elrond's brother, but still, as far as I remember, there are some other lines, some other ancestry lines that connect Elrond to Aragorn besides this direct line of Elros, his brother. But for the purpose of this video, it's not that important. Probably will make some video, I'll make a video for you about Elrond's ancestry and Aragorn's ancestry, which will give you a full detail of all the relatives that they have and had. But what we can take from this for the purpose of analyzing his physical attributes is that, first of all, he had a much bigger lifespan, active lifespan than a usual human, and so he had much more time to practice his skills than Atreides. That's the first thing that we should understand. And another one is that being partially an elf, he must have had some specific strength that the elves, high elves in the Tolkien's universe have. For example, he must have had very keen eyes. He must have been a very, which is which is definitely proven by reading The Lord of the Rings, for example. He must have been very, very proficient with his bow, and not just because he was a ranger, but and not only because of his training in Elrond's house, but also because of his natural abilities. But let's look at his human parts too, because his human part is also not so simple as it may seem, because his human ancestors were from the first man. They were from those men that first came to Middle-earth, that were the first tribes to have been awoken in this world. And this ancestry, this ancient ancestral line that he has was very, very powerful. He had such amazing ancestors like Tuor, for example, who also deserves a special video made just about him. But for now it's enough to say that the human part of Aragorn, so to say, was also very, very powerful. And so in order to have a full picture of how he looked, let's read a small excerpt from The Lord of the Rings about him. But before I start, I also want to say that he was very tall, he was very powerful, and in this like sheer human strength, sheer physical strength, he definitely has an upper hand if we blindly compare their physical statures. But let me read the excerpt. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and the light was about him. The Return of the King, the Steward and the King. And now let's talk about the Aragorn's fighting style, its intricacies, who was he taught by, probably, and what kind of martial education did Aragorn get. And here it gets interesting, because Aragorn, being one of the Dúnadan, could have easily got his main martial arts practice from his own people, but being an Isildur's heir, he was upbrought in the house of Elrond from a very young age. And actually, until his 20th anniversary, he didn't even know that he was human, I suppose. At least he didn't even know that he is an Isildur's heir. Maybe he knew that he was one of the Dúnadan, but he definitely had no information about his ancestry. And I suppose that Elrond, who was his stepfather, he understood very well that telling him that he's one of the Dúnadan without telling him about his ancestry would raise a lot of questions. For example, why is he being upbrought in Elrond's house and not with his own people? So that's why I think that Aragorn, till his age of 20, believed that he was Elrond's son. And in a way, being his relative, even though a distant one, in terms of the amount of people, the amount of generations that had passed since Elros, he could have still been considered Elrond's son. Well, I may even humbly assume that Aragorn was quite alike Elrond in his facial features, in his ways of, in his voice, in the ways he talked. So I suppose he really did look like Elrond's son. And there is a great quote which describes Elrond himself, and you'll see that there is some connection to the quote that I've recently presented to you about Aragorn. So listen carefully. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. venerable he seemed as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was the Lord of Rivendell, and mighty among both elves and men. The Fellowship of the Ring. Many meetings. That's a really great quote, I love it. It gives you such a full description of this character without going into too much detail, but we can all see Elrond like he's right here with us, in the same room or in the same place where we are. That's amazing. The way Tolkien writes is just superb. But let's return to Aragorn's martial education and his fighting style and his mentors. Well, I believe that his main teacher was Elrond himself, because Elrond understood that for a future king, Aragorn must have the best knowledge available, and Elrond, being such an accomplished fighter, such an accomplished duelist and strategist, so he definitely supervised his training and gave him lessons himself. But more importantly, what we should understand here is that Aragorn was upbrought among elves who had centuries and some of them thousands of years of active fighting against many enemies that were in Middle-earth. And they also had millennia upon millennia of experience of fighting among themselves and fighting orcs and fighting the great enemy, and not only Sauron but even Melkor himself. Since the beginning of time, almost since the beginning of time. And they accumulated such a diverse and full knowledge of fighting strategy, of fencing. They definitely had their own fighting style and methodology, how to prepare anyone to fight. And in case of Aragorn, who was definitely in his physical form very gifted, and he had around him one of the best fighters in the whole Middle-earth and best fighters who could spar with him. And so I believe that he had become quite an accomplished fighter already by his age of 20. And this was not yet even the start of his education, of his training, because he had decades upon decades of training and fighting, and he had fought in campaigns of both Rohan and Gondor. You probably do remember the famous line in the Lord of the Rings movie, The Two Towers, the second movie, when the daughter of King Théoden asks Aragorn if he really did fight, if he really had fought alongside Theoden's father. And you can just imagine how much fighting experience Aragorn had by the time when the whole War of the Ring started. So basically Aragorn was not only a theorist, he was not only somebody brought up by the best teachers of his world, of his time, but also he was an experienced practitioner of this art, of the art of fencing and art of war. Now let's talk about some kind of an X factor that each fighter has, or at least each fighter should have, about some special abilities or maybe gadgets or magical items that both fighters could have possibly used in a fight between two of them. So for Aragorn, I would say that one of his main X factors is, of course, his Ring of Barahir, but it's not really clear what kind of power it may possess. Maybe if I find some interesting information about the real use of Ring of Barahir by Aragorn, I will definitely make a video about it. But I still suppose that this kind of an artifact, this kind of heirloom that he enjoyed to have, would probably, at least it would give him some kind of a mental edge in a fight. I'm sure that such an item in the world of Lord of the Rings would definitely raise the spirits of anyone who is wearing it, and especially Aragorn, as this ring was one of the ancestral heirlooms of his family. It is also quite safe to say that his weapon of choice, his sword, and it doesn't really matter if we talk about the reforged Narsil, or even the Aragorn sword that he used before Narsil. Both these weapons had been crafted expertly for Aragorn, and more than that, he had years upon years, decades upon decades of practice and active fighting with his weapons. So that definitely gives him a special edge in any kind of close quarters combat, in any kind of fencing duel. Also, Aragorn probably had great pieces of armor for different occasions. Light armor for his ranger work, so to say, and heavier armor for war. He also had his healing powers in his hands, which was mentioned in the quote I gave you in the first part of this video. I'm not sure how it could have helped him in the fight, in the heat of the moment, but still I think that may mean something when every point of skill, every point of experience matters when we're talking about a fight between such powerful individuals. And after all this talk about Aragorn's special abilities and his items and his upbringing, it may seem that Paul has nothing to offer in this regard, but that's not true. Actually, in some ways, Paul's powers and his special items that he could use in a fight, depending on what kind of a fight it is, and of course, and what kind of circumstances of this fight, but still, his special abilities and items are top-notch. For example, well, one of the most obvious things that I have already mentioned in this video is his shield. It's such a superb technology, and it gives a fighter a serious edge against many types of attacks, especially fast attacks, some kind of flicks with the blade. It gives you a possibility to adapt to the fighting style of your enemy while they try to understand what kind of power messes up with their strikes. And so even the use of his personal shield is a great advantage that Paul has in a fight against even somebody as powerful as Aragorn. But there is more. Paul also, we should remember that Paul was brought basically as both a mentat and as a kind of a male Bene Gesserit witch. So he had powers to persuade with his voice, with his actions, with his gestures, and in such a fight it may mean a lot. Of course, Aragorn, as a stoic being, as a hero, he will not be as susceptible to such things, but still, every move counts. But there is more, because Paul actually has the power to foresee the future. He has the power to see how the events will unfold. That power was given to him by his exposure to the so-called spice melange, which is known to give such an ability to any human being, and the whole space guild that controls the space travel in the Dune universe is fully dependent upon this resource. And Paul, being already a very psychically powerful being, when he got exposed to spice, his powers were multiplied manifold. By the way, interesting note that Elrond himself also had the power to foresee the future. It was one of his unique abilities, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he stayed safe and unharmed for such a long time in such a war-torn universe as Arda, which is, for those of you who don't know, is the name of this whole Tolkien's world, which includes not only Middle-earth but also some other places. But it's better to stay on topic, and probably I'll do some videos about it too, but for now let's continue. And last, about Paul's X factor, but definitely not least, is the fact that Paul had an access to the so-called Kris weapons, Kris knives, which were made from the Shai-Hulud's teeth, and the Shai-Hulud is the big worm, which is one of the very important parts of the ecology of Dune, and those worms seem to have no problem in chewing and digesting big machinery, and we can safely speculate that a Kris knife has kind of armor-piercing properties besides being a ceremonial kind of weapon. So probably Paul could use some kind of a Kris knife or maybe even a Kris sword in such a fight. And now finally, after taking all this into account, let's look at different scenarios of the possible duels. I think it's a good idea to start with the hand-to-hand combat without any kinds of weapons and any kinds of armor, and of course also without using any shields or any other gadgets or magical items. In this scenario, I think that it's pretty obvious, at least to me, that Aragorn has an upper hand in this, and he has an edge over Paul Atreides. He's just bigger, he had much more experience of different kinds of brawls during his times in different wars and military campaigns, and I think that in terms of hand-to-hand combat, his knowledge would be as profound as the weirding way that his Paul Atreides' Bene Gesserit mother taught him. But of course, Paul has some chance in this fight. He's witty, he's strong, even if not as strong as Aragorn. He has profound knowledge in the weirding way in different types of hand-to-hand combat skills. He has his special tricks in his sleeve, so to say. For example, he could try to use his voice on Aragorn. At least it could give him a chance in some fight like this. So I would say that, so if we took like 10 fights, I would say that Aragorn would probably win in 8 of them, and Paul Atreides would win in 2. Now let's look at a classical duel, so to say, a classical Renaissance kind of a duel. So in this duel, anyone can use their special tricks, anyone can use their special gadgets, especially if they don't look like something serious. For example, Paul's shield would not look as something inappropriate in such a spontaneous street duel. So we can imagine Aragorn walking some street, some medieval street, and he meets Paul Atreides, maybe under the influence of his spice addiction, losing his mind, losing his reason, and they start to fight. Well, in this case, I think that Paul Atreides has a lot more chances than in the previous one. First of all, because of the shield factor, which I have already explained earlier in this video, which would probably force Aragorn to change his tactics. He would need to adapt. Some of his fast strikes probably wouldn't get to their target the way Aragorn would suppose they would. And so, considering this kind of scenario, I think that I would put like 6 out of 10 fights in Aragorn's favor, but I would really like to read your comments about this and what you think, and what kind of chances would you give to each of our today's contestants. Maybe you think that they are equal in this kind of fight, like 5-5, or maybe you think that Paul Atreides would win. But let's go forward in our analysis, and let's discuss a kind of a duel which is fought in an official sports event or in an official tournament, where they would have sport replicas of their weapons, and they wouldn't have any armor, they wouldn't have shields. I mean, Paul wouldn't have his special energy shield. And in this case, I think that the game would change drastically, and I believe in this kind of a scenario, Aragorn would have a serious advantage against Paul Atreides. And I think that in this scenario Aragorn would also win, but like 7 out of 10. Not 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10. And now let's look at a classical medieval duel when they are in full armor, when they can use everything they have, and for example, they can also use different kinds of mounts in combat. For example, Paul would be able to use Shai-Hulud, maybe a small one, and Aragorn would be able to use like an eagle against Shai-Hulud, and maybe his horse against some kind of a buggy, or even an ornithopter used by Paul Atreides. And then when they're dismounted, they would fight in full armor. I think here finally Paul Atreides would have a serious advantage, and probably he would be able to beat Aragorn like 6 out of 10 times, maybe even more, even though Aragorn would not be that confused by Shai-Hulud, in my opinion, because I think he is used to fighting different types of armies, different types of monsters, people, and I think that using his strategical thinking, using his profound knowledge of military campaigns, he would be able to withstand this kind of unequal, asymmetrical, in terms of Aragorn's own mount, enemy. But it should be noted that, in my opinion, if we take into account a scenario where they fight in full armor from the very beginning, without any mounts, without any kind of special help, I think in that case they would probably be almost equal, and I think it's the only case where they would have 5-5 in terms of the combats won. And maybe one more scenario where they would be equal is if they fight against each other but leading a small group of their trusted warriors. In this case, I think that, of course, depending on the place where they would fight, if it's some kind of familiar place for Aragorn's, let's say, Dúnadan, or Elrond's elves who help Aragorn, or maybe some elite force of Gondor, if they fight on their own land, that may give them advantage. And if Paul Atreides lures Aragorn into the sands, then his fighters would have an advantage, his freemen would have an advantage. But all in all, I think that in this scenario the results would be also about 5-5, more or less equal. So any kind of an outcome can possibly be in this kind of fight. So thanks for listening till the very end of this video. I'm very proud of you, and I would appreciate your likes and subscriptions. See you in the next video, and good luck.